NBC News correspondent and NBC News Now daily anchor Morgan Radford visited the town of Lincoln Heights, where residents have formed an armed community defense group in the wake of a neo-Nazi rally.
What happens when a community, left vulnerable by both hate and a failure of law enforcement, decides to take its safety into its own hands? Is this a necessary act of self-preservation or a dangerous descent into the same violence they seek to escape? In the small, majority-black village of Lincoln Heights, Ohio, a disturbing neo-Nazi rally on February 7, 2025, triggered a profound response. The rally, which featured demonstrators waving swastikas, brandishing rifles, and shouting racial slurs near a local school, sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. For the residents, the rally wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a terrifying reminder of the hostility and hate that still lingers, just beneath the surface. But the lack of action from law enforcement left the community feeling exposed and unprotected, forcing them to confront an unsettling question. When no one else will protect you, what options do you have? From this fear and frustration emerged the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program, a volunteer-based patrol group created as a direct response to the rally. With tactical gear and the weight of history on their shoulders, these volunteers are not just responding to an attack on their community, they're standing guard against the ghosts of a painful past, one that has shaped their collective resolve. But in their efforts to protect their own, they've raised new questions about the role of self-defense, the limits of the law, and the ongoing struggle for autonomy and safety in a world that often seems to ignore their existence. So, will this have an impact? Let's find out. The streets of Lincoln Heights had never felt more dangerous than on that chilly February afternoon in 2025. What began as a quiet, normal day soon turned into a nightmare for the residents of this historically black village. As children poured out of their schools at dismissal time, the atmosphere quickly shifted from routine to tense and unsettling. A group of neo-Nazis, waving swastikas, shouting racial slurs, and brandishing rifles, had gathered just outside the local school, a deeply symbolic act given the school's central role in the community. For Lincoln Heights, a village founded in 1923 as a sanctuary for African Americans fleeing racial violence in the South, the sight of these men marching proudly with symbols of hate was more than just a shock. It was a grotesque reminder that the struggles of their ancestors were far from over. This was no random act of aggression. It was a calculated provocation, meant to remind the residents of their place in a society that has long tried to silence and marginalize them. The neo-Nazi rally, as it unfolded near the school, was not just an isolated act of hate. It was part of a broader pattern of emboldened insurgency that had been creeping into public spaces across the country. In a time when hate crimes are on the rise and racial tensions seem to be at an all-time high, the rally was the latest in a series of acts meant to intimidate marginalized communities. But it wasn't just about the hate being hurled in their direction. It was about the deeper, systemic problem of what happens when the state fails to intervene when the law seems impotent in the face of rising insurgency. Despite the shock and fear that gripped the community, the response from law enforcement was almost apathetic. Officers from Evendale and the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office did arrive at the scene, but the outcome left the residents even more disillusioned than before. While the rally was unfolding in full view of children and residents alike, no arrests were made. Authorities claimed the neo-Nazis had not technically broken any laws, even as their actions, waving rifles and shouting racial slurs, felt like an open challenge to the very existence of the community. To those living in Lincoln Heights, the lack of legal intervention was nothing short of a betrayal. In the face of such overt racism and intimidation, the community felt completely abandoned by the institutions they were supposed to rely on for protection. The rally wasn't just an isolated incident, it was the embodiment of a society that had allowed hate to thrive unchecked, a reflection of the broader racial and political tensions roiling across the nation. Durrance Daniels, one of the key spokespeople for the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program, expressed the frustration that many felt after the rally. "It's like allowing someone to break into your home again and again," he said, likening the inaction of law enforcement to a failure to protect one's own home from invaders. This analogy struck a chord with many in the community, who had long felt the absence of proper police protection. and who now saw the rally as just another instance of the state choosing to look the other way. For Daniels and other community leaders, this rally was the final straw. It was the moment when they could no longer sit idly by and wait for help from authorities who had consistently failed to keep them safe. And it wasn't just about this particular event. It was about a long history of neglect and indifference that had left Lincoln Heights vulnerable. The dissolution of the local police department in 2014 had already created a vacuum in security, and the reliance on outside law enforcement agencies, who were often seen as disconnected from the community's needs, only deepened the mistrust and resentment. But it wasn't just a failure of law enforcement that galvanized the community into action. It was the way this rally exposed a deeper, systemic failure in how the country handles hate and racism. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The rally, in its brazen display of hate, seemed to represent a return to a darker time in history, a time when racial hatred was publicly visible and government action was either passive or complicit. It felt like a rejection of everything that the community of Lincoln Heights had fought for since its founding. The residents of this village had built a sanctuary from the violence and prejudice of the South, only to find that the same forces of hate were knocking on their doors once again. In response, the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program was born. But this was more than just a simple neighborhood watch. It was a direct reaction to the failures of the institutions that were supposed to protect them. It was about taking back control, standing firm in the face of fear, and refusing to let hate dictate the terms of their safety. The community's decision to arm themselves was not a knee-jerk reaction, nor was it about an eagerness to escalate violence. It was a reluctant but necessary step, taken in the face of a broken system that had repeatedly failed them. The creation of the Safety and Watch program marked a turning point for the community. It was no longer just about responding to one rally or one event. It was about redefining their relationship with law enforcement, their right to protect themselves, and their collective agency in a society that had often overlooked their humanity. What started as a direct response to one hateful act of aggression has grown into a broader movement, a symbol of resistance and survival in a world that continues to test the resolve of marginalized communities. But the fallout from the rally wasn't just emotional, it was political and legal. Ohio's laws, which permit open carry of firearms without a permit for legally owned weapons, had created a legal foundation for the community to act. And yet, as the program formed, questions began to swirl about the role of self-defense, the boundaries of legal action, and the broader implications of armed community patrols in a nation divided by racial and political lines. In the aftermath of the rally, Lincoln Heights stood at a crossroads. Would the community continue to rely on a system that had shown time and again that it could not protect them, or would they forge a new path, one that placed their safety in their own hands? The creation of the Safety and Watch program would set the stage for an ongoing debate, not just about self-defense, but about the right to exist safely in a society that too often fails to shield its most vulnerable from hate. As the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program grew and solidified its presence in the community, the legal and moral questions surrounding the armed patrols began to emerge. At the heart of this controversy was a fundamental question. When institutions fail to protect you, do you have the right to take up arms to defend yourself? The answer, while seemingly clear to some, is far more complicated when placed under the scrutiny of both Ohio's open carry laws and the broader national conversation about the role of armed self-defense in a divided society. Ohio, like many states in the U.S., has laws that allow for the open carry of firearms without a permit, provided the firearms are legally owned. This legal backdrop provided the foundation for the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program. Volunteers armed with their legally obtained weapons began to patrol the streets, effectively stepping into a role once reserved for law enforcement. While the right to bear arms is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, the decision to form an armed patrol has raised significant questions about the extent to which communities should take matters into their own hands when the state fails to protect them. In Lincoln Heights, the feeling of abandonment was palpable. The dissolution of the local police department in 2014 had already left the community with little faith in external law enforcement agencies. The rally of neo-Nazis in 2025 only reinforced the idea that the authorities were incapable of protecting the community from hate and violence. The armed patrols, while grounded in legal authority, were born out of a deep-seated distrust of institutions that seemed more inclined to defer to the perpetrators of hate than protect the victims. From a legal perspective, the volunteers patrolling the streets of Lincoln Heights were within their rights to carry firearms. But from a moral standpoint, the situation was murkier. Was the decision to arm themselves an act of empowerment or a step toward vigilantism? Should the community trust that their actions, rooted in self-preservation, would be seen as justified, or would they be painted as dangerous radicals taking the law into their own hands? The debate over the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program is, in many ways, a reflection of the broader national discourse on self-defense and gun rights. On one side are those who argue that the right to bear arms is essential for protecting communities, especially in areas where law enforcement has been ineffective or absent. For these individuals, the presence of the patrols in Lincoln Heights represents an act of self-reliance, a refusal to be victimized by forces outside their control. For them, the armed patrols are a necessary safeguard, one that ensures the safety of families, businesses, and children in a world where institutions have repeatedly failed to do so. On the other side, however, are those who question the need for armed patrols, especially in communities that have historically suffered from over-policing and systemic racial injustice. Critics argue that when marginalized groups arm themselves in response to perceived threats, they run the risk of escalating violence and becoming the very thing they fear. The specter of vigilantism looms large, as armed groups, no matter how well-intentioned, can quickly spiral into conflict, especially when tensions between communities and law enforcement are already strained. Could the creation of an armed patrol, while a response to a very real threat, ultimately lead to more harm than good? This moral dilemma became even more pronounced when business owners like Eric Ruffin voiced concerns about the program. Ruffin, who supported the overall goal of the community's self-defense, still expressed hesitation about the use of force. "We don't want to become what we hate," he said, acknowledging the tension between protection and aggression. The challenge for many residents like Ruffin was finding a balance between securing their neighborhoods and maintaining the moral integrity of their community. They were aware that while their actions might be legally justified, they could also become a flashpoint for further violence and division. At the heart of this dilemma is a tension between two competing ideas: the right to self-defense and the dangers of overreach. In Lincoln Heights, the community had watched as law enforcement allowed hate to fester, as neo-Nazis were allowed to rally in public spaces without consequence. For many, the formation of the armed patrol was not just an act of resistance, it was a declaration that the state had failed them, and it was now up to them to safeguard their futures. But how far could they go in protecting themselves without crossing a line into actions that could be deemed unlawful, or worse, escalatory? While the program remained legal under Ohio's open carry laws, questions of legitimacy and moral righteousness loomed large. Was this an empowerment of the people, or a reflection of the deeper issues plaguing American society, where some communities must take matters into their own hands simply to stay safe? The question of whether the community was justified in their actions, or whether they were feeding into the very violence they sought to prevent, was a deeply divisive issue. The law, of course, is not always a perfect reflection of morality, especially when it comes to issues of race and power. In a country where armed self-defense has historically been weaponized against marginalized groups, the idea of Black residents arming themselves for protection can be particularly fraught. The specter of Black communities taking up arms is often seen through a different lens than that of predominantly white groups engaging in similar acts of self-defense. The history of gun violence, particularly against Black communities, adds a complex layer to the debate, one that questions the fairness of the legal system and whether Black communities are ever truly afforded the right to protect themselves without fear of repercussion. In Lincoln Heights, the armed patrols were not merely an assertion of their right to bear arms. They were an expression of a community's enduring struggle to live freely, without fear of violence. As the group patrolled the streets, they were not just protecting their homes, they were protecting their dignity, their history, and their future. But in doing so, they faced the harsh reality that in a deeply divided society, even the most righteous acts of self-defense can be questioned, distorted, and even vilified. As the Safety and Watch program continues to expand, the legal and moral questions surrounding it will only grow more complex. What began as a response to one rally has become a defining moment in the community's ongoing fight for safety and self-determination. But as the program stands at the intersection of law, morality, and race, one thing is clear. The residents of Lincoln Heights will continue to fight for their right to exist without fear, even if that means challenging the very systems that are supposed to protect them. Remember, the formation of the Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch program is not just a political or legal response. It is deeply rooted in the psychological and emotional trauma that residents of Lincoln Heights have endured. For the Black community here, the neo-Nazi rally was not just a momentary shock. It was a stark reminder of the everyday fear they have lived with for generations. The program, born out of necessity and survival, is also a response to the emotional toll that years of systemic racism, community neglect, and violent threats have taken on their collective psyche. The constant weight of fear, the sense of being under siege, is not easily quantified, but it permeates every aspect of daily life in Lincoln Heights. For many residents, the rally was not just an isolated event. It was a reminder of the ever-present possibility of violence, hatred, and intimidation that they could face on any given day. For a community built on the idea of refuge, this constant threat has become a cruel irony. The historical sanctuary they had once created to escape the violence and oppression of the South now feels like a target in its own right. Emotional trauma in communities like Lincoln Heights is not simply a response to specific incidents, but the cumulative effect of years, decades even, of racial hatred and institutional neglect. The rally, the absence of legal intervention, the historical dissolution of the local police department, all of these elements come together to create an environment where fear is a constant companion. And it's not just fear of external threats, but the fear of being ignored, neglected, or left defenseless by those entrusted with their protection. The decision to form an armed patrol was, in many ways, a direct response to the emotional trauma of living in such a state of vulnerability. While the patrol is often viewed as a practical defense mechanism, it also serves as an emotional lifeline, a way for the community to regain a sense of control and agency. For residents who have long felt that their safety was always at the mercy of others, the program provides a means of reclaiming power in a world that has often left them powerless. It is an effort to counteract the helplessness that many have internalized over the years, a statement that says, "We will protect ourselves no matter the cost." But this emotional burden is not without its costs. The volunteers in the patrol are not just carrying firearms, they are carrying the weight of a community that has been under siege for far too long. The psychological strain that comes with arming oneself for the protection of others is immense. There is an unspoken awareness among the volunteers that the decision to patrol is not just about defending against external threats, but also about protecting the emotional well-being of their neighbors, their families, and their children. The fear that drives them is not just physical fear, it is emotional and psychological fear, the kind that lingers long after the immediate threat has passed. For many, the psychological toll is compounded by the fear of retaliation. As the patrols became more visible, many of the volunteers began to fear for their safety. Masked and in tactical gear, they were engaging in what could be perceived as an act of defiance in a world where Black communities are often policed more harshly than others. There was always the underlying concern that their actions, however justified, could lead to more harm, either from those they were trying to protect themselves from or from law enforcement that might see their actions as a threat rather than a necessity. This fear of retaliation was not just a fear of physical harm, but also of the emotional and psychological toll it would take on their families. The members of the patrol knew that they were opening themselves up to being targeted, not only by neo-Nazis or insurgent groups, but also by the very systems they were attempting to challenge. It's a fear that extends beyond the volunteers themselves and into their families, who in many ways are forced to live in a constant state of uncertainty. Yet, despite these fears, the decision to continue with the Safety and Watch program speaks to the resilience of the community. It is a form of collective healing, a way to protect each other, and in doing so, restore a sense of hope in a world that has long seemed indifferent to their struggles. But the emotional toll remains, and it cannot be easily alleviated by simple acts of defense. The scars left by years of neglect and hate will take much more than a self-defense program to heal. They require a reckoning with the broader systems that have allowed this fear to fester, unchecked and unchallenged, for generations. The emotional toll of living under threat, of constantly being aware of one's vulnerability, also highlights the deeper need for change. The Lincoln Heights Safety and Watch Program, while necessary, is a temporary measure, a stopgap in the face of deeper societal issues. The community's fight for safety, dignity, and respect is not just a battle against external forces, but an internal struggle to maintain their mental and emotional health in the face of constant fear. Until the larger systems that perpetuate this fear are addressed, the psychological cost of survival will continue to weigh heavily on the shoulders of those who live in Lincoln Heights. In the end, the Safety and Watch program is not just about armed defense, it's about the emotional and psychological survival of a community that has been forced to confront a world that, all too often, seems to refuse to acknowledge their humanity. Do you think that when the state fails, locals should do something on their own? Let us know in the comments section. Will this be a wake-up call for the state? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.